So if I'm in Sydney and Brody's in Portland and Casey, if you're in St. Louis, what's St. Louis famous for those who don't know?
I would say the Arch, gooey butter cake.
Okay.
Those are two big ones. And toasted raviolis.
Toasted ravioli, really?
Mm-hmm.
I could get
Controversial.
behind that. I could get behind that.
Controversial.
Delicious.
All right. All right. Good to know. Good to know. Introductions out of the way. Brody, roll the credits. From Sydney, Australia, all the way to Portland, USA, two misfits hang out after class to riff on the B-sides of professional life. These are your professional misfits. All the way from Sydney, Australia, I'm your host, Christopher Sellers.
From Portland, Oregon, I'm Brody Ipox.
And we are your professional misfits where we riff on the B-sides of professional life. And for season 4, episode 9 Misfits, we're talking about loneliness. We're talking about the epidemic and social fad that is loneliness. And I brought a friend from LinkedIn. I brought now Dr. Kacie Smart, who successfully defended her PhD dissertation. Congratulations, Miss. And thanks for joining us, and thanks for being a misfit.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So for folks who don't know, you're a therapist, you're an executive coach, you're a consultant. Can you give us a little background on yourself, your work, why you sort of stepped into this field, and part of your PhD, which I was a subject for sort of towards the end of last year. So, and how that's sort of relevant to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is as a mental health clinician, worked in various roles across various, different types of organizations and schools and residential programs and just nonprofit agencies. Also have done some work in like corporate response, like EAP work and things like that. And
Right,
just
yeah, okay.
across all of those different things, found that there are just a lot of systemic and organizational issues that really get in the way when it comes to the service and really connecting with people, right? And really providing that safe space and doing that in a way that's consistent. And so that's what inspired me to pursue the PhD, which is in business psychology, because I just wanted to become more equipped to support leaders, to support organizations, and to support people in getting rid of those barriers, navigating that complexity so that we can actually connect and we can be really intentional about the way we work within a system, the way we work directly with each other, and how we approach work itself.
So I remember, if I remember correctly, part of your PhD research was interviewing mental health providers and sort of identifying the challenges they had, and then interviewing mental health, say, clients or patients, which was me in my case. Even in Australia, I said, is my experience going to be relevant? In case he was like, yeah. And then so having both sides of the fence trying to understand the disconnect of service. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. So I interviewed all different mental health stakeholders, from clients and clinicians, but also non-direct providers. So maybe I work in an administrative role in an agency, or maybe I'm a direct care provider who is not licensed or something like that. And just trying to get all of the different perspectives of people participating in the field, because from my experience, there was a disconnect. And what the research found actually was a bit surprising, that although there is a disconnect between what we practice and what the priorities of the stakeholders are, the stakeholder priorities are actually pretty well aligned.
Interesting.
Super interesting.
Super interesting. That's what doctors do. They research, and then they have to back it up. So this dovetails neatly into this conversation on loneliness. So I think the very simple place to start is what is the definition, right? Because I know it is possible to be by yourself, like to be alone, but not lonely. And if you open any account or any social media account or anything on YouTube, there's at least half a dozen videos on why are we lonely, why are Gen X, Y, Z, why is loneliness this epidemic, and is it an epidemic? But we're going to start with like a definition. So Brody, being the non-doctor, I'm going to start with you first. So what's the average Joe's perception and definition of loneliness?
I don't know if I'm an average Joe, just because
the average misfit, the average Joe misfit.
There we
go.
You go. It's weird listening to Kacie kind of talk about the structure of it as like a service and that kind of deal. It kind of makes me think on it a little bit deeper. And I think for me, loneliness is that disconnect, right? It's not being understood. It's not having someone to go to. It's not necessarily being alone. It's just that when you are alone, you have nowhere else to turn, and that to me, that's the loneliest I've been, is when I could be sitting in a room with my entire family, but none of them can help me with what I'm going through. That's a tough spot to be in. And again, because of the fact that there's that huge lack of understanding or that disconnect between being able to translate or even express yourself in like a potent way, that's lonely. Like that's lonely to me. And I imagine for most people, even that kind of have trouble putting a definition to it, if you boiled all of their problems down, it would probably be that they were misunderstood, and that's lonely to me.
It's that famous Robin Williams quote, isn't it? It's like being by yourself isn't the hardest thing. It's like being in a room full of people and feeling alone. Like that's the hardest thing. Kacie, how does the layman's view sort of stack up to how the medical academics might view loneliness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very aligned. I think, like you said, Brody, what it boils down to is a feeling of just being misunderstood, of being disconnected, no matter how close we might be in proximity, but still having that feeling of nobody understands or nobody gets it, right? So I'd say it's pretty well aligned.
Is it okay? Is it an epidemic? And Kacie, I'll go to you for this first, because these sort of buzzwords love to get thrown around, because it's clickbait, it generates engagement, blah, 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 blah. But is it as prevalent and significant on the Gen Pop as we might are led to believe?
That's a tough question. And it's a really great question, because I think there are so many things, especially in the field of mental health right now, that seem like an epidemic. And really what has happened is we're just more aware. We're talking about it more. There's less stigma and we're being more open about it, right? And so it feels like, oh my gosh, we're, experiencing things like loneliness at such alarming rates, when I think sometimes it's been there, right? But we just haven't quite talked about it as much. But I do think there, like you mentioned, generations like ours, millennial, Gen X, Gen Z, even, like feeling different types of experiencing different types of identity issues, not issues per se, but I think we're open and allowed to explore ourselves in different ways than some generations previous. And so that has created situations, I think, in some cases where we are feeling more lonely and we are feeling more disconnected, through this effort to truly connect with ourselves, and then feeling like, Well, the people immediately around me don't mirror that.
That's a really, really, really interesting point and a really insightful dichotomy, I think, because part of why we started this podcast, I even posted about it this morning, was like we know there's a lot of disconnected professionals out there. And so part of the reason we're having this podcast is to have these awkward conversations that you're not going to have at work and sometimes feel like you can't have with partners, friends, or family around you. And the point that you make is like, well, if you go on this journey of self-exploration and self-understanding, it causes you to reflect on the people around you, the relationships you're in, the work environments, and all those sorts of things. And you might start to recognize that these people aren't my people, these values aren't my values. And that can be a little bit traumatizing to some, because then if my family aren't my family, how do I reconcile who I am and where can I find people that are like me? And so before I sort of delve too far down this rabbit hole, like my next very simple question sort of for all of us was like, when was the last time that you felt loneliness or experienced that real sense of like, I'm not understood, I'm disconnected, there isn't anyone that I can talk to about this? A real simple example has got to be when COVID like wiped everyone out. So all of a sudden you're taken out of your workplace, you can't go back there, you can't talk to them, you can't hang around the water cooler, you can't casually have lunch, you couldn't even hug people. Remember, like we were elbow bumping for quite for months afterwards. So there was physical detachment, all those sorts of things. Brody, I'll throw it to you, my man. Like, do you get lonely? Like you've now got 5 kids and a partner. So, what was it? What is loneliness for you? How do you experience it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being brutally honest and transparent, I feel it every day. I mean, I think, and it's a struggle too, because it's like you said, the reason I started this podcast is because I think, if I'm being real, all of us kind of feel that on a daily basis. I mean, we're all so unique and we all have such individual experiences that it's so incredibly hard to find someone that you yourself allow those barriers to drop that you can relate on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it might not even be the same experience. It might not even be the same setting or environment. It's just something that you're allowing to click. You're like, oh yeah, that you are like me. And I think, yeah, and not in a way that like every day I'm sitting with my head in my hands and I'm crying myself to sleep, but there's definitely moments every day where I'm like, damn, I'm a father of 5. I'm trying to make a podcast a incredibly impactful giant thing. I've got things that not a lot of people would relate to, and I sit with that often, and I kind of ask myself why, like, is it something that I'm doing because of that loneliness? Is it something that, I feel like will fix that? Blah, blah, blah. It's all those things. And that's it for me, not to make it so lame and simple, but it's like a daily thing. I think it's at least once a day I'll look around and, no one necessarily really knows. And, I think a lot of us too hide an internal dialogue that is maybe not as harsh as mine can be, but I think a lot of us go
You'd be
through that.
surprised.
Yeah, but yeah, right. That's kind of what I think. Like
It'd be associated with other things. You find yourself lonely, and then normally the first question is, well, why am I lonely? And then inner critic kicks in, and normally it's your fault because,
yep,
or X, Y, and Z. I mean, we're seldom kind to ourselves in those moments. It normally takes a little something else. But Kacie, I'll out you as well, because just before we came online, you mentioned like around about December of last year, you were made redundant, and you're like, yeah, so shit, loneliness. So that was how did you manage then? Because Dr. Kacie is now technically unemployed going into the new year, and how did you navigate?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the scenario that came to mind. It's going from working on a team, a small team, but still a team, back to being a
Mhm.
solopreneur. And it was lonely and is still sometimes, especially because, newly Dr. Kacie, right? So finding my way in the space as a
Yeah.
PhD, right? As a practitioner
Hmm.
at a different level, right? And figuring out like, who am I now? I am still a therapist, right? But I'm an organizational psychologist. And that's completely different. And so, how do I make my way in this space? And how do I create this space for myself? And how do I help people understand what that even is, right? Like, I say my PhD is
Hmm.
in business psychology, and people are like, uh-huh. Yep. But what really is that? What does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So just figuring it all out.
Yeah. I get it. Um, I suppose I better go now because I pushed you two under the bus. So
Yeah, I was about to. I was gonna say, if you try to slide out of this one,
you
don't
can't just
even.
you can't just host and ask questions. You need to come to the table with something. That's fair. Look, it's funny. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, all right. I'll try not to get too deep and dark. Look, I know. I also know. Like, I care about two things: creativity and mental health. I like to talk openly about both. Like mental health and loneliness, they go hand in hand. They're not exclusive to one another. They do go hand in hand. There are times where I'm a single guy, I live alone in a bachelor pad, also doing the solopreneur thing with, two or three sort of large projects. So Kacie, totally empathize where it's you hit doctor level or you feel like you've leveled up in some respects and you feel like you're sort of standing on the mountain just a bit further up and then everyone else is slightly out of reach because you're in a different atmosphere. It's like, well, I don't want to climb backwards. I want to maintain my integrity where I am, but they say it's lonely at the top, but it's sort of true in some respects, because anyway, yeah, don't have an immediate partner that I can share these things with. I have, a handful of close friends. I'm very lucky. I took account of this over the course of the weekend. It was actually two or three girlfriends, around who will check in, who can actually have the deep and meaningful conversations about life and finances and work and relationships, and they understand and they get it. So I because I know what loneliness is, I'm very, very grateful for those relationships. um, but at times when it's bad for me, it's it's heavy and it takes an actual physical toll. Like you physically ache. Well, I physically ache um, when when they get hit by the loneliness, mental health, depression freight train. And there's a lot of other things that can get mixed up in that. Like, yeah, you become critical. Yes, you can try and think your way out of it when really I just need to rest and shut down. And then I resent myself for needing to rest and shut down because I haven't done anything today. It's like, look, I don't get to make these rules sometimes. And one of the most accurate descriptions of my depression, anyway, when it comes to loneliness, is depression sucks specifically because it's one of those insidious illnesses that polarizes you. It makes you feel you're alone. And the way I would describe it is, everyone else is in the playground and I'm stuck in a glass box. Like I can see you and I can hear you, but I can't touch you. And the best someone can do is come over and sort of tap on the box and can is everything okay? And I'm like, yeah, sure, yeah, great. And you sort of muddle along in that way. Now that's my personal experience. Some of you listening might relate or not, and that's okay. But I know I'm one person. I know medically I'm kind of a statistic. Like I'm a male, I'm over 40, I'm a professional, I'm single, I have no kids. So I skew much further down the risk factors of mental health and loneliness and depression. So it's something I have to be aware of, and it's something I actively have to work against, and I do. And that's a conversation for another time. But I guess this then starts to drive to the next part of this conversation. It's like, if I feel this way, and if other people feel this way, and if other people can identify with Brody and Kacie, and if there's a more open discussion around what loneliness is and how it affects us, then the natural question for me is, where has this come from? Right? If it's a societal problem, where has it come from? Kacie, in your experience as a doctor and in your research, what are some of the things that you've discovered that you know, or do you have any answers to this epidemic of loneliness?
Yeah, I mean, I think you called out some really important points. You both did when it comes to loneliness and mental health specifically, because mental health is an epidemic. We know this, right? One that was, elevated by COVID and some of the more recent things happening. And because there is that connection, right? If we are experiencing mental health issues at this alarming rate, loneliness is also going to come along with that, right? As you kind of described, Chris, right? Like, and you too, Brody, right? Like, because we then get into these internal narratives that, make us go into the cycle, right? And when we get so deep in that cycle, that's when we get lonely, right? No one can possibly understand where I'm at right now. And so I think because they are so connected, that's part of why we're seeing, this epidemic of loneliness, because it is very much connected to our mental health and very much connected to our mental health access, right? Our ability to get quality care, to address our needs in a way that feels good, in a way that is helpful and beneficial to us. And so another issue is that we have a massive shortage of mental health providers, right? Based on a lot of the factors I shared earlier in terms of my research in the United States, at least. I'm not sure, what you all are experiencing over there.
Brody and I were sort of casually having a chat before you came on, just to gauge like access. Like, I know that the private healthcare system is very, very different in the States compared to specifically Australia and even other places in the world. And so when I was sort of briefing Brody on your PhD dissertation and how I contributed and what it was about and what we sort of discovered in that conversation, and Brody's reflex was like, yeah, like no one in the States can afford it. I said, it's interesting you say that, because even in Australia, where it is more affordable, I still reason there's a reluctance to engage. So in the States, you seem to have a compound issue of like, even if you could afford it, would you then step over that bridge to access it? And that's probably an entirely separate discussion. But I guess I'm really sorry to interrupt, but there was one question that stuck out to me, which I'd be really interested to get your insights on, Kacie, and that is, did you find a discrepancy between male and female participants in terms of wanting to engage with mental health providers? Because there's still the stigma, massively so for men, that, you can't, you don't, you must be strong for all of these reasons. And, it's no joke that masculinity...
You don't need it, is the conception.
And it's like tough enough and all of that, And so it's the masculinity is killing men, that sort of discussion. And you're sort of pushed by both sides. You're sort of pushed by like the bros to be bros, and you're supposed to be strong and silent and get on with it. Brody, like even you mentioned in a previous episode, like when your mum passed, like I got to be strong for my kids. Yeah. Like you're also sort of setting the example that like men don't cry even when their mother passes away.
Right.
So there's a discussion there to be had. But conversely, like how many women, partners, wives, daughters, mothers would accept their son, husband, father being genuinely vulnerable in this way? So there's this passive there's this passive sort of pressure that seems to be applied to men. And so I'm wondering now, with greater awareness and greater access, was there any like marked distinctions between, let's say, female engagement of mental health services and wanting to address loneliness versus male patients?
Well, based on the focus of my research, I don't know that
Yeah,
I didn't really look at that.
fair.
Surprisingly though, because I did work with people who are already engaged in the mental health system. There were, I would say, probably about an even distribution of male to female people who identified as clients. Um,
Awesome.
people who
Yeah.
are directly receiving a service, which is pretty
Mhm.
cool to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. It is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Brody, was I accurate, or did I put words in your mouth?
No, I mean, you nailed it,
Yeah.
and that's, I've said it in the past. I think, especially for me here, when I sit and reflect on it, and I look at my father, and I look at my grandfather, and I look at the men around me and how they react to emotional situations or experiences, that is kind of the consensus, right? Like, if I portray my pain or my loneliness or my depression, then I'm thought less of, and I don't have the ability to handle it. I'm not who you would trust to lead you through the same situation. Those kind of thoughts go through your head, and it sucks because I'm in that cycle as a father. And when you had said that to me in that episode, I've took, and I told you this, I've taken a ton of time to kind of reflect and deviate from that path. And it's still really, really, really hard for me to cry in front of my kids. Like, I'll still walk out of the room if I have a moment, or like that kind of thing. But I've taken a lot more direct approach to confronting and being honest about the feelings that I'm having, because I think one of the things that is fucked up for men and that happens for their children is, because of that situation and that dynamic, you then create, like you said, kids that feel they can't tell you, right? I can't be sad or depressed because dad isn't. He's strong, and that's what I need to follow to be accepted and loved, and that kind, and it's just a fallacy, and it's fucked up. So you're doing that to your kids. And then number two, what I'm also telling them is that, in my mind now, since having that conversation, is I don't directly know how to deal with it. I'm specifically telling them that. Even though I'm not expressing emotion, and that's the guard, and you're strong, I'm directly telling my children I do not know how to communicate and or show up physically to you as a person that can communicate in those moments. And that shit hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, I want them to be the boys, the men that can say, time out. I'm feeling, this is fucked up for me, and be able to express it in a way that it is effective. It's effective. And whether that's emotionally or, through words or, actions where it's like taking a moment or whatever it is, that it's done with, and this is why I love your pitch, Kacie, is that it's done with intention, right? Like, you understand why you're doing the things you do. Hey, boys, I'm going to take a step away from you for a minute because I'm sad and I don't know how to talk to you guys about it. That's a much different conversation than being in an emotional situation with all my boys and then me randomly disappearing.
Yeah, just going to work on the car.
It's like, what? Dad, just go. What the? So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question directly, but that's
it does, and it prompts me to come back to you, Kacie. So even let's say wind back to last year, wrapping up your doctorate, suddenly made redundant, disconnected, and lonely, and a little bit lost. Like, personally, did you reach out to anyone, or is it because now you're a strong, independent, professional Black woman, you're a doctor, I got to handle this on my own? Or did you feel like you had friends, family, a partner that you could communicate your sense of disconnect with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, both. There definitely was a
Fair,
period
yeah.
of time where I was just kind of like, what just happened? Right. And also, it happened right as I was nearing the finish line. So I took all that energy and like
Mm,
zoomed in into the work and said, I'm going to finish this thing and I'm going to finish strong. And then once that happened, then I kind of was in that space of like, oh, what do I do now? And
yeah,
at that
yeah, yeah.
point, I think I had gotten some of that energy out, and I had also like achieved this amazing milestone, right? So I'm
Mhm.
feeling more in a space to share. And I did, I shared, with, I mean, of course, my husband was there through the entire thing, and he's always there for all of it. But
Mm,
people in my network professionally, other people who I had worked with previously, to say like, I'm not in that specific space anymore. I'm, kind of transitioning and figuring out what space I want to be in. Um, so
mhm,
that they could kind of help me figure that out. Right. And through a lot
mhm.
of different conversations, I have been able to kind of clarify like where I am and where I want to be, as I, transition and in this new space as Dr. Kacie.
Dr. Kacie. Um, that's what I was talking about. Where did this come from? Brody, do you have any? Casey touched on COVID and how loneliness is related to mental health and all those sort of factors. So it's a very intricate sort of web for a lot of people. Um, do you have any? Do you have any sort of observations of where you think it comes from, or are you gonna blame the kids and their social media?
No, I think social media can be a great tool to kind of eliminate that kind of feeling. And I've talked to you about that before. Um, no, so it's interesting. Both of you have kind of said something about this, in previous points. I think it's been a problem for a long ass time. I,
Mm,
I mean, I think shit, you just look at our history, just talking solely United States, right? Just look at our history. We've been going through shit for quite some time. And the the environmental and emotional charge from all that, I mean, it's got to at some point do something to the mentality of the people involved. Like, and that's my big thing. I think it's been a problem for way longer than any of us want to admit.
mm,
And now what's happening is we're just seeing it. We're just seeing it. And we're able to tell people, even if it's shit, it's not someone directly. If it's not someone directly, I've made a piece of content solely geared towards expressing that I was lonely. And fuck, it reached 15,000 people, and that says something to me. So I don't think it's a new thing, like I don't think it's just like coming out of the woodworks. I think
yeah.
it's been there. And I think where it's coming from now is, again, because we're talking about it. I mean, what are you going to do? You're not going to confront it. You're just going to fucking say some shit about it, and then we're just going to leave it as is. I mean, I don't think that sits well with anybody. So as much as people aren't necessarily asking, what can I do to fix being lonely? I really truly believe that's kind of the subconscious intention of being willing to connect on it. And that's where you're seeing it so much. You're like, holy shit, it's fucking everywhere. No, I mean, everybody's just willing to admit at some point they're fucking lonely.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a video in a second, but there's some research in this video that says that at least 60% of people that they surveyed admitted to being lonely at some point, like on a day-to-day basis. And like that was at the highest percentage. At the lowest percentage, it was somewhere between like 20 and 30% would admit, so there's a fairly broad spectrum and a large slice of people that feel this way. The highest demographic where this occurred was in children 16 to 24. Now, the reason I frame this statistic right now is I'm going to give you my hot and spicy take, and it comes out of something you've just said and something that Casey said right at the beginning, is that I would suggest that little doses of loneliness are actually really good and healthy for you. because and this is probably why it's such a spike between 16 to 24, because those are sort of formative years where you have a bit of knowledge under your belt, you have a bit of experience, you've been to a few high schools, you might have dated a few people, and once you start hitting adolescence, you're taking a good strong look at your parents, these sorts of things. And like Kacie was mentioning, you're starting to figure out, this works for me, this doesn't. This hometown doesn't work for me, this doesn't. Everyone knows I want off this island. It's like, I'm European at heart. Like, Australians just don't do it for me. I love my family. There's no way I could survive in my hometown. I'm a city kid. I'm also the only one. I'm an arts kid. I'm also the only one. So I have a little bit of experience of being the black sheep, being alone, trying to figure out what the fuck I'm doing. Also, negative traits aside, I'm also the kid that travels solo. I took off to London for 2 years on my own. What was I going to do there? No idea. I arrived at a fucking backpackers in Rotherhithe, London, on the Thames. Didn't know a soul. Felt lonely? Yeah, got to figure it out. Find your first little share house. Figure out, do I know these people? No. Did I get along with any of them? No. It was just like we all shared a room in the same place. Was I kind of lonely? Yep, got to figure it out. Traveled to Vienna and Prague on my own, and all these sorts of things. So there are times where you are going to feel lonely and disconnected because it's a realization that the people and the places and the things around you aren't a reflection of probably your inner world and circumstances and your values and what you want. And I'm going to suggest that that's a good thing, because you have two options. You've got an option of either I've got to figure out what it is that I want and start actively pursuing that, or you're going to become angry and scared and go, it's too hard, and just retreat back into the safe, cozy fold of same town, same family, same relationship. This is why people keep going back to partners that really aren't good for them. It's because they're terrified of what is out there, and the existential threat of the unknown is worse than, how many people stay in bad relationships because they're terrified of being single? Like, that's indicative of what we're talking about here. So generally, en masse, we can identify that sustained loneliness has effects on your mental health, has effects on your physical health. Another one of the stats from the video, which I'm going to mention in a second, is that chronic loneliness is as destructive to your system as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day. And with that comes, factors of stress. With that comes, so effects on your nervous system and what that can do to the rest of your body. So I can't think of the correct medical terms, but these are all linked to, not directly caused by, but linked.
Yeah, correlated.
To. Thank you. Correlated.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So something to think about. So that's my hot and spicy take. Dr. Kacie, how do you feel about being lonely some of the time?
Well, first, we can't just leave that hot and spicy take without just acknowledging that it's so spot on. It's just gold. So yeah, it's just so important to just acknowledge all of those things, and acknowledging that loneliness is a part of our human experience. And it is a part of that experience that can help us get to a better life, a better human experience when we allow it to do so. So yeah, in terms of feeling lonely some of the time, especially after having said all that, it's a good thing, right? And thinking about just my specific example of, feeling lonely. It was in these pivotal milestone moments, right? And still, in a space where I'm doing something I've never done before. And yeah, it's lonely and it's scary.
Yeah.
But I can't not do it, right? I have to do it so that I can grow.
Like, you're a doctor now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I agree. It's good for us. It's good for us. And I think, sharing this perspective on loneliness hopefully will help people lean into it a bit more rather than, like you said, kind of cower away, because when we do that, we're just creating more loneliness for ourselves.
And
Mhm.
and probably some more fear around something to avoid it. Brody, do you endorse being lonely some of the time?
I do. I do. I mean, 100%. I think it's in the grindstone that the final product is made. So it's like it to me, it's the same thing. I've really, really tried over probably the last 5 years to make that loneliness less of a negative thing, and just like you just said, Casey, more of a this is the journey I'm on kind of thing. And and don't get me wrong, sometimes it's still difficult to shit. You're sitting there
Yeah.
and you do revert to the head and the hands, and you're lonely. You're just lonely. But then when you come out of it and you have that realization, holy shit, I'm doing something nobody around me is doing. Not a single fucking person I know is doing what I'm doing.
Mm.
That's fucking cool too.
Yeah.
It's cool. And I think some of the most fascinating, amazing people were probably some of the loneliest people on the planet. And again,
Historically, that seems to be accurate.
right. And I,
Unfortunately.
but that's the thing. I love that you said it like that, because without this conversation, I don't think I would have realized that I was doing that. Like, as much as it was a thing and it can become a healthy thing for me to also be able to put my finger on it. That feels like I feel like you just unlocked a superpower for me, where it's like the next time that shit creeps in, I've got another really solid line of defense
Mm.
to combat that. And I think there's a ton of people out there that could use that. You trust that the loneliness is going to feel bad, but you can also trust that in the loneliness there's something spectacular. So it's a weird little paradox, right?
It is a good point. And that sort of brings me to this video that I want to talk about. So it stems from the question that I asked both the guys of where does this thing come from? Where does loneliness come from? Why is it so hot right now? Now, there's a video, there's a channel on YouTube called Big Think, a whole bunch of short videos on all sorts of very, very interesting topics. There's one specific video called How Loneliness is Killing Us by Harvard professor Robert Waldinger. Okay, so it's probably about 4 or 5 minutes long. It's worth a watch if you can find it. The key takeaway that I've already mentioned the stats and stuff in here, is like, where did loneliness come from? Why is it so popular right now? It's like, it's interesting because there's been research on loneliness that goes back. They've been studying it since about the 1970s. And they found that the trends and the indicators for loneliness stem further back and originated around the 1950s. And there's two specific causes that he mentions here. The first was that we became more mobile as a society. We suddenly had access to like personal vehicles and cars and things like that. So you can now travel away to go to school. You can travel away to go to work. You can commute, you have suburbs that are like building themselves out away from cities. So we started to become more spread out and disparate as a society. In and of itself, not a bad thing. But objectively, you can identify that if all of a sudden, when grandma used to live next door, because we used to live in these little communities, and all of a sudden I can pack the family and the kids, travel across country because dad's got work, and we're going to go set up in another town, you can see how that would start to tear us out of the social fabric of what we've known. All right? It's just something to be aware
Normalize
of.
disconnecting from it too.
Correct. But it's a factor. Like, objectively, this was a factor. Now, the second factor, which I find particularly interesting, is that around the 1950s was the introduction to the home television. And this is where we started to notice that families would go out less. You would start to invite the neighbors around for game night less. You'd have people to watch your kids less because you can just put them in front of the TV. Okay. So we'll have a generation of boomers saying it's the kids today and mobile phones. And I called one of these fuckers out on LinkedIn, as a matter of fact, because you said exactly that. Like, kids today, social media, bunch of fake friends. And I'm like, bro, I've never heard a more like kids today speech. He's like, I didn't say that. I'm like, you literally said this. And I cited this video at him, right? So if you're even early 20s, mid 30s, you can come to understand that this wave or even culture that breeds loneliness as a symptom isn't your fault. And before, in the 1950s, there was one screen in the home, right?
Mm-hmm.
Move through to the 1980s and 90s, there might have been 2 or 3 screens in the home. Now you probably have a dozen. And now the game is to hold your attention on these screens for as long as possible. Okay. So when we dial it back to what's the definition of loneliness, and this Harvard professor gives a really similar description to the both of you, is it's a sense of social disconnection, of like not feeling personally connected to anyone or anything sort of around you within your space, right? That was their definition, and these are the traits that they've noticed, which have stemmed back from the 1950s. So it's reasonable to assume that this has snowballed over the course of decades, and silently and passively, like a slow boiling frog, to be where we are now. And so this is sort of why everyone throws their hands up in the air and goes, oh, kids today and social media and fake friends. I'm like, not exactly, How does that sound? Kacie, you're sort of nodding and shaking and find it very fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, right? For that to have happened in the 1950s, or to kind of be dated to that time.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, over time, what we have in terms of screen time, in terms of how we connect with our families, with our friends, with our communities, right? As we've increased those different ways of communication and distraction, if you will, that has also decreased the genuine connection, the sit around and chat, the playing cards, the
The
going to
physical
my
touch,
neighbor's
which is
house.
a big
Yeah.
part of loneliness and mental health. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, yes, like the argument can be made that social media, yes, it does bring us close together. It's like, yeah. However, when you look at the evidence and you look at what we're dealing with now, there's a whole bunch of other factors that are sacrificed. If you come to rely purely on social media, like it has some benefits, absolutely, but you need to be aware of the negatives and how to mitigate those at every possible turn. Brody?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of going through that right now. I have 5 kids. Screens are a thing. It's been pissing rain. Everybody's been sick for the last 3 weeks. Kacie, was insane that you said you've had your little home for 2 weeks. I've had mine home for 3.5 full missed school. He's been here. And yeah, I love him to death, but it's a thing. And yeah. I don't know. I again, because I don't want to be that person that's like, oh yeah, it's the TVs and it's the phones, but I mean, it's like you said, look at the pros versus the cons, and I mean, there is a ton on both sides of the fence. But I'm going to be honest with you, if we're genuinely transparent about the cons, and we're talking about physical, we're talking about mental, we're talking about emotional, we're talking about social, all these different factors, the cons list far outweighs the pros. Far outweighs the pros, especially with prolonged and heavy use like we're talking about, right? And I worry, and I think that that's kind of the same thing. As much as there's this access to people and you can feel connected. I think there's also a hollowness to the kind of digital connection when it's not done intentionally and in a healthy way. Because again, I've had tons of people that are my friends online. I've met maybe 5 out of 10 years of being online that I still talk to and have done something with or care about or, you know, have involved myself with to this day. That's a drastic difference in the number of people that I've come across online, you know, and I beg to say that it's just us not really understanding that it's in the way, right? Because again, I think it can be such a beautiful tool and it can be this wonderful thing. But it's funny when you're sitting here feeling alone, you're scrolling through video after video,
Watching
feeling
videos
alone,
on everyone else who feels alone. Yeah.
and there's 5 people right there that you could look up to and say, hey, I feel alone right now. That would probably make a much greater impact on you than any of the videos that you're going to continue to watch. So yeah, I don't know. I don't solely blame it on the screens, but I blame it on the lack of understanding and what those mean. It's like the same thing as cigarettes to me. Every motherfucker and their grandmother smoked cigarettes because it was the cool thing to do and it was popular and social. And then, hey, look, fucking 10 years later, we decide, yeah, that shit's pretty bad. You know, let's probably not do that. So it's the same thing. I think we're kind of catching up. You know what I mean? As you introduce all these things and these technologies grow as quickly as they have, that's the backlash, is right? Like we're way behind. We're way behind.
Yeah, I always say it's the tradesman, it's not the tool. Like you can't blame social media. Like you use social media, so you need to regulate and discipline yourself. You know, that's you're responsible. It's not the tool, it's you. It's the artist, it's not the brush. So this brings us right towards the end where we can talk about some solutions, folks. Like, so it's great to have an understanding of the landscape and how it affects us and what the challenges are. But, okay, I'm lonely. I don't want to be lonely. How do I fix it? You know, how do I fix it without picking up my phone and looking at Instagram? Okay. Dr. Kacie, this is where you step in. In your research, what are some solutions? What are some methods? What are some hacks? What are the 10 top tricks? The 10 top tricks to not be lonely.
Well, I think it's a lot of what we were just kind of talking about is just understanding ourselves, right? And our behaviors and what is leading to this feeling of loneliness, right? And what's contributing also to this feeling of loneliness. If I'm just sitting here scrolling on my phone rather than connecting with someone who's sitting across the room, that's on me. And so I have to first be aware of and recognize that that's what I'm doing, right? And get out of that pattern of thinking, pattern of behavior. And I think too, what we were talking about earlier in that sort of mind shift, that reframe of the value that loneliness can actually play in our lives and understand that it can be a very valuable thing to push us to new heights and to push us to, you know, grow and do things that we've never done. And so I think those, you know, are really great tools, right? Being able to recognize within ourselves what's causing the loneliness and then do something about it while also understanding the value that leaning into it can bring to us.
Well said. Brody, you have to follow that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, it kind of came from our conversation, Chris, where you pointed out to me, you know, that what are you actually showing the boys? And that's the thing. And just like Kacie said, it's a ton of self-reflection. Ton. If you have that, if you can look at yourself in a setting that is, maybe it's not always healthy because, you know, like I said, that internal dialogue can be a bitch. But I think if you can get into that arena and you're willing to be there, that's when those changes actually start to come about, right? And it might not be in that exact moment that you're having that fight that you understand, oh shit, this is how I fix being lonely. There's my dogs. I'm sorry about that. It's not in that moment, but it comes to you because of, like Kacie said, the fact that I was willing to stand in the arena. Because if I wasn't, and I did just continue to scroll, or I didn't analyze that behavior or those things that are exacerbating a problem I am aware of, man, that shit's just that's on you. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing else to it. And I know it sounds so simple and probably ridiculous and cliche, but find somebody that, if you can't hold yourself accountable for those actions that might not be fucking positive, can give you that insight without it being an attack. Because I think that's the best thing that I've had is, you know, our conversations in your friendship, the growth I've had in my relationships, the ability for people to come to me and say, hey, shit, you might not be feeling great because you haven't been to the gym for 2 weeks. Hey, you might not be feeling great because you're shoving all this shit down and you're not talking to me about it. That's been the biggest saving grace that I've ever had, is the support system. And I know that's not always practical, right? But I think it is always possible. I do.
Well said. Yes, it is possible. All right, so here's, well said. Possible, practical. Very well said. Here's what I do, because I'm the single guy who lives by himself. I take care of my, swim 3 times a week. I take care of my health as best I can. I have a regular cafe that I go to every morning. It's purely a passive social experience. If this cafe was a bar, it would be Cheers. It's the sort of place where you can walk in, everyone knows everyone, they know what they drink, everyone, kids goes through all that. You get it. It's a social vibe. It's the only reason I go. The funny thing is as well, like, I make coffee there on a weekend, on a Saturday. It started during COVID because they couldn't get anyone to work on a Saturday, and I used to be on the tools. I'm like, I'll do it. And so it's sort of a gimmick for everyone in the hood. It's like 5 days of the week, I'm on this side of the counter, and then on a Saturday morning, I'm on that side of the counter. And they have a hard time reconciling it. And then everyone on LinkedIn has got no fucking clue, because if I'm like building tech startups and running a podcast and doing this, and I have all this shit going, but then still spend my Saturday mornings making coffee. I do it because it's sort of meditative for me to have like labor. The boss is cool. It's a social thing. And I can kind of turn my brain off and not solve all the problems of the universe. I can just make a latte, and I can drink good coffee. But it's where Brody was saying, like, what's practical? Like, this is purely passive. You know, hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? You're socially interacting with people who will follow up with you, you know, today, tomorrow, how's your life going? And you start to build those sort of passive relationships there. Another practical thing I do, which I'm sort of renowned for, you can't quite see it here, but I've got like 92 handwritten journals sitting on the back shelf. So, and that whole habit started because I was lonely. I broke up with my girlfriend, and then my best friend took her side in the breakup, and I had no one, and I had to move back home. And the only person I had that I could talk to was a blank page. So that's how I started writing. And we talk about this inner critic. That's how at least I'd get the inner critic out of my head and onto a page, and then read it back and go, it's a bit ridiculous, bro. It's a bit hardcore. Like, you know, and so you'd read it back and go, okay, that's, you know, really unrealistic and harsh, but cool. Like, we got all this shit out of the way. What are the positives? And then so you start to sort of rebuild your scope. It's a really simple tactic that works for me. If you journal, try it. There's something else that I've been doing lately that I've only just caught myself is like, you know, I work for myself. I work mostly from home. So after the social experience at the cafe, I'm home by 8 or 9 o'clock. I'll do some admin, and then by 11 a.m., I'm kind of done for the day. Now what am I going to do? Right? And so I find myself, it's like, I just, maybe I should go into the city. I'm like, why? Like, just, I don't need anything in the city. I don't need to buy anything. I don't want to shop. I'm like, just go in the fucking city. And so it, for whatever reason, it forces me to dress like an adult, go into the city, walk up and down the streets and just be around other commuters, other workers, other tourists, all that sort of thing. And it's that passive sort of influence that there are other people and other things going on in the world, right?
Energy.
So if you're feeling lonely,
really
kind of shutting yourself away even though you feel like shutting yourself away in a dark room, do that for a day. But then on day 2, take some action to sort of counter that. And so, the simple reason is I'm lonely and I've got nothing to do today. And me going for a walk and doing nothing, and even just throwing on some headphones. Sometimes I'll take the camera, take some shots, whatever. But if we're talking about loneliness and wanting to feel connected to people and things around you, and I'm talking about practical steps. I'm not making best friends. I'm not asking the waitress, like, what are you doing later? Do you want to hang out? No. I'm just passively being around and engaging with other people. You know what I mean? And just seeing how it feels. And I'm telling you, by the time I get home, I'm like, good choice, Chris. That was better than sitting at home in front of a laptop. That was better than writing an article. That was better than whatever. You know what I mean? Go down to the park. I've got a really beautiful park here. You can look at the harbor and play with all the dogs. That's better than sitting in a room. So from the 3 of us, hopefully there's some practical tips that you guys can take. There's some advice that you can kind of take. Who knows? It might just all be trash. I don't know. But at least this was one video. This is one video on loneliness that might be worthwhile. That's it. Dr. Kacie, any final thoughts? If people want to work with you, if they want to find you and know what an organizational psychologist does and how that affects them, where's the best place to find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. And my website is smartcounselingsolutions.com, or you can email me at smartcounselingsolutions@gmail.com. Kacie Smart. Yep.
Correct. Did you always get that at school? Like, are you smart? Kacie Smart? Miss Smart?
It's my married name. So I always joke that I chose my husband solely based on the name.
That means you're a smart doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
Well done. Well done. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for sharing your insights and making the time. Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Brody, that's the end of episode 9. You should know what's coming up next.
Yeah, I mean, it's the wrap up. It's every season. Come on.
It's a bit of a layup, bro. I can't make it any simpler.
Yes, I got it.
There it is, Misfits. That brings us to the end of Loneliness on season 4 is episode 9. We've only got 1 episode left to go, which means you can find us on YouTube and Spotify. You can watch us for free, and you can listen for free and watch us build. That's the tagline. You can get all the sexy merch discounts and watch everything 2 weeks in advance. Get all the bonus episodes at Camp Misfits. So go to promisfitspodcast.com for all the pro services and to find Camp Misfit and get access to all the goodies. You can find Brody and I on LinkedIn. We're normally hanging out and talking shit. That wraps it up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you're feeling less lonely. And so in the meantime, I've been Chris.
I've been Brody.
And I'm Kacie.
Okay. Nice. And we'll see you on the next one, Misfits. You stay classy.